under duress. The covenant that never was.
Under Duress Part 4, The Economics of Dependency, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X, June 30th, 2026, Chapter 16, Debt as Social Architecture. Every mechanism examined in Parts 1 through 3 required some institutional apparatus to administer it, a church, a state, a colonial bureaucracy, and electoral system. Debt requires none of this in any centralized form, and that absence is precisely what makes it the most efficient consent manufacturing architecture examined anywhere in this book so far. Debt does not need a chronicler to narrate its legitimacy, a guardian to administer its terms, or a propagandist to manufacture belief in its fairness. It only needs time, compounding arithmetic, and a population that has been persuaded, gradually and almost universally, to interpret financial obligation as a personal failing rather than as a structural condition engineered, in significant part, by the terms under which credit is extended. The loan as the purest contract covenant collapse. Return to Chapter 1's foundational distinction. A contract survives on enforceability. A covenant survives on continuous voluntary renewal. No financial instrument in ordinary economic life makes the contractual character of the underlying relationship more explicit, or disguises it more thoroughly in the language of opportunity and partnership, than the loan. Examine a standard consumer loan against the sovereignty test developed across this book. The capacity to know requires the borrower to genuinely understand not merely the stated interest rate but the full compounding mathematics of the obligation being undertaken, a requirement that, as extensive financial literacy research has documented, a substantial portion of borrowers in even highly developed economies do not actually possess, not from any personal deficiency but because compound interest, examined honestly, behaves in ways that resist intuitive comprehension even for people of considerable general education. A disclosure document that states an interest rate in compliance with regulatory requirement, written in a register few borrowers can translate into an accurate felt sense of total lifetime cost, satisfies the letter of informed consent while failing its substance. Precisely the fraud by omission pattern examined in Chapter 3, where no individual statement is false but the aggregate effect produces belief substantially divorced from reality. The capacity to refuse fails more starkly still, for the population this chapter is most concerned with. The loans most structurally significant to lived economic experience, medical debt incurred during emergency treatment, housing debt incurred to secure basic shelter, educational debt incurred to access credentialed employment increasingly required even for modest economic stability, are rarely undertaken from a position of genuine alternative. They are undertaken precisely because the alternative is unavailable or catastrophic. Forgo emergency medical care, remain unhoused, forgo the credential that has become a structural precondition for employment in an economy examined more fully in Chapter 19. A loan accepted under these conditions satisfies Chapter 2's exit cost test in reverse. Refusal, not acceptance, is what carries the catastrophic cost, which means the agreement to borrow more closely resembles submission to the only survivable path than genuine choice among comparably viable alternatives. Compounding as structural duress. What makes debt distinct from every other mechanism examined in this book, and arguably more corrosive in its long-term operation, is that the obligation does not remain static once incurred. It grows mathematically according to terms set entirely by the lending party, in a manner the borrowing party, having already failed, in many cases, to fully grasp the compounding mathematics at the moment of borrowing, frequently cannot accurately track in real time. This produces a particular and under-examined form of structural duress, an obligation that can expand faster than the borrower's capacity to discharge it, particularly under conditions of unexpected income disruption, medical emergency, or simple compounding interest outpacing minimum payment structures specifically designed, in a portion of consumer lending, to maximize duration of indebtedness rather than to facilitate its efficient resolution. The borrower trapped in this dynamic has not violated any term of the original agreement. They are experiencing the agreement performing exactly as its underlying mathematics specified, mathematics they were nominally informed of and substantively unlikely to have genuinely internalized at the moment of signing. This is structural duress in its purest contemporary form, because it requires no individual lender to act in bad faith at any single moment. The duress emerges from the compounding mathematics itself, applied at scale across a population whose collective failure to fully grasp compound interest is not a coincidental gap in financial education but a remarkably stable and exploitable feature of human cognition that the lending industry, across its long historical development, has had every incentive to study, understand, and design products around rather than to correct. Debt as civilizational technology, not merely personal circumstance. It is worth stepping back from the individual loan to name what debt accomplishes at the scale of an entire economic system, because the individual transaction obscures a structural function that becomes visible only in aggregate. A population carrying substantial debt obligation is a population with sharply reduced capacity to refuse unfavorable terms in every other domain of economic life examined throughout this book. The worker carrying significant debt cannot easily refuse unfavorable employment terms, because refusal risks the income stream required to service obligations whose own terms penalize missed payment severely. The debt does not merely fail Chapter 2's exit cost test in its own right, It actively manufactures exit cost failure across every other economic relationship the indebted person subsequently enters, functioning as a kind of structural amplifier that converts a population that might otherwise retain meaningful bargaining leverage into a population for whom nearly every available choice has been pre-narrowed toward continued compliance, continued employment, continued participation on whatever terms happen to be available. This amplifying function is not, in any single instance, the result of a coordinated plan. No single lender designs a loan with the explicit goal of suppressing the borrower's future capacity to negotiate favorable employment terms. The effect emerges from the simple aggregate mathematics of widespread indebtedness interacting with the simple aggregate mathematics of an economy in which most participants depend on continuous employment income to service continuous debt obligation. Precisely the diffused, authorless architecture this book has identified repeatedly as coercion's most durable and least contestable modern form. Credit access as manufactured inclusion. A particular irony deserves attention here, because it illustrates how thoroughly the language of opportunity has come to substitute for the substance of genuine choice in financial life. The extension of credit to populations previously excluded from formal lending markets is frequently described, and frequently experienced by recipients, as an expansion of freedom, access to resources, to opportunity, to participation in an economic mainstream previously closed off. This description is not entirely false. Genuine access to credit on genuinely fair terms can expand a person's realistic field of choice in exactly the way Chapter 4's sovereignty framework would recognize as legitimate. The irony emerges when credit expansion into previously excluded populations occurs disproportionately on terms structurally worse than those available to populations with greater existing resources. Higher interest rates, less favorable repayment structures, more aggressive penalty terms, justified, often accurately on narrow actuarial grounds, by the statistically higher default risk associated with lending to populations with less existing financial cushion. The result is a credit market that performs the rhetoric of inclusion while delivering, to the population most vulnerable to compounding's corrosive mathematics, precisely the terms most likely to convert temporary financial difficulty into permanent structural indebtedness. This is not necessarily evidence of deliberate predation in every instance. Actuarial risk assessment is a genuine constraint lenders operate under, but it is evidence that the language of expanded freedom and the substance of expanded vulnerability can occupy the identical transaction simultaneously, and that the rhetoric, predictably, is the half of the transaction that gets emphasized in the product's marketing. What debt reveals about the architecture this book has traced. Debt deserves its place as Part IV's opening chapter because it demonstrates, with unusual clarity, the central claim this book has built across 15 chapters. That the most durable and pervasive forms of manufactured consent require no single villain, no centralized conspiracy, and often no individual bad actor at any specific point in the chain. They require only a mathematical structure, compounding interest, in this case, interacting with a predictable feature of human cognition, the systematic underestimation of compounding's long-term effect, at sufficient scale and over sufficient time that the resulting population-wide pattern of structural dependency emerges as a stable, self-reinforcing feature of the economic landscape, defended by no one in particular and dismantled by no one in particular, because no one in particular is actually responsible for it in the way the legal and moral vocabulary this book has examined throughout requires before responsibility can be meaningfully assigned. The next chapter turns to the relationship that debt most directly and most consequentially shapes: the employment contract, and the specific mechanisms by which an agreement nominally between two free and equal parties has, across the development of modern economic life, come to encode an asymmetry of bargaining power that the contractual form itself was never designed to make visible. Chapter 17. Employment Contracts and Invisible Coercion. The employment contract occupies a peculiar position in the architecture this book has been tracing. Unlike colonial treaties or coerced confessions, it is rarely described, even by its sharpest critics, as fraudulent or forced in any straightforward sense. Both parties typically sign with apparent willingness. No gun is present. No explicit threat accompanies the offer letter. And yet the employment relationship, examined against the sovereignty test developed across this book, reveals an asymmetry so structurally consistent across the entire modern economy that its near-universal presence has come to be mistaken, by employer and employee alike, for the natural and inevitable shape of work itself rather than a particular, historically contingent arrangement that could, in principle, have been built differently. Two parties, asymmetric exit costs. The employment contract is conventionally described as an exchange between two free parties. The employer offering compensation, the worker offering labor. The description is accurate as far as it goes, and it is precisely the point at which it stops going far enough that the contract covenant distinction from Chapter 1 becomes essential. Apply Chapter 2's exit cost test to each party separately, rather than treating the contract as a single undifferentiated agreement. For the employer, refusal to reach agreement with any single prospective employee typically carries modest, bounded cost. The position remains unfilled briefly. Other candidates exist. The business continues operating through the interim. For the worker, refusal to reach agreement, declining an offer, or more consequentially, leaving an existing position without another secured, typically carries cost of a categorically different magnitude. Loss of income required for housing, food, healthcare access in systems where healthcare is employment-linked, and in economies thin on social safety net, the rapid approach of genuine material crisis measured in weeks rather than months. This asymmetry is not hidden. It is, in fact, openly acknowledged in ordinary economic vocabulary, the employer's market versus the employee's market, a phrase that casually concedes the entire point this chapter is built around. Bargaining power between the two parties to an employment contract is not fixed or symmetric, but fluctuates with conditions largely outside either individual parties' control, and for the overwhelming majority of the population, across the overwhelming majority of historical conditions. The asymmetry runs structurally in the employer's favor, because the employer's exit cost from any single negotiation is bounded while the worker's exit cost from prolonged unemployment is not. This is precisely the condition Chapter 2 identified as structural duress. Not the explicit threat of any single employer, but an economic architecture in which the worker's realistic alternative to accepting whatever terms are offered is frequently a form of hardship severe enough to make refusal, in any meaningful practical sense, unavailable, while the contract itself, examined as a document, displays no trace of this asymmetry, because the asymmetry exists entirely outside the four corners of the paperwork. In the surrounding economic conditions the paperwork is silent about and never required to disclose. At will and the vocabulary of symmetric freedom. Many employment relationships are governed, in their default legal form, by doctrines granting either party the right to terminate the relationship without cause and without extended notice, a structure frequently described in its own defense using language of mutual freedom. Both employer and employee retain equal right to walk away at any time. This symmetry is genuine at the level of legal form and almost entirely illusory at the level of lived consequence, for exactly the reason established above. An employer's exercise of at-will termination typically costs the employer the administrative burden of finding a replacement. An employee's exercise of the identical legal right typically costs the employee their income, and depending on the surrounding economic and social safety net context, potentially their housing security and healthcare access as well. Identical legal language, applied to two parties with categorically different exit costs, produces a relationship that satisfies formal contractual symmetry, while utterly failing the substantive sovereignty test this book has applied to every institution examined so far. This is the employment relationships version of Chapter 1's central claim. The document specifies mutual rights. The surrounding conditions determine whether those mutual rights translate into anything resembling mutual freedom. At-will employment, examined as a legal instrument in isolation, looks scrupulously fair. At-will employment, examined as a lived relationship between two parties with structurally different capacities to absorb the consequences of exercising their identical formal rights, looks considerably less so. The manufactured humility of the workplace. Chapter 9 identified manufactured humility as a mechanism by which populations are taught to distrust their own judgment in precisely the domains where deference happens to serve the institution cultivating the deference. Workplace culture has developed a remarkably refined version of this same mechanism, worth naming directly because of how thoroughly it has been absorbed into ordinary professional vocabulary. Employees are routinely encouraged, through training, performance review language, and informal cultural norms, to interpret dissatisfaction with working conditions as a personal attitude problem requiring internal adjustment rather than as potentially accurate information about the conditions themselves. Language emphasizing resilience, adaptability, and a positive attitude, genuinely valuable dispositions in appropriate contexts, frequently gets deployed specifically in contexts where the more accurate response to a stated grievance would be structural change rather than individual psychological accommodation. An employee who raises a legitimate concern about unsustainable workload, inadequate compensation, or unsafe conditions, and who is met with messaging suggesting the appropriate response is improved personal resilience rather than institutional correction, is experiencing precisely the inversion Chapter 9 identified. Manufactured humility deployed to ensure that the employee's own judgment about their working conditions is treated, by the employee themselves, as the variable requiring adjustment, while the conditions generating the dissatisfaction remain untouched and unexamined. This mechanism is particularly effective in employment contexts because it operates through channels, performance reviews, professional development frameworks, workplace culture initiatives that present themselves as genuinely supportive, oriented toward the employee's own growth and well-being, which makes the underlying redirection of accountability considerably harder to perceive than a more explicit demand for silence would be. Non-competes, golden handcuffs, and engineered friction. Chapter 5 established that the right to say no, when surrounded by sufficient friction, becomes functionally equivalent to its absence. Employment law has developed an extensive toolkit specifically engineered to install exactly this friction around an employee's capacity to leave. Non-compete agreements restrict a departing employee's ability to work in their own field for a defined period, frequently extracted as a condition of initial employment, at precisely the moment, worth noting, when the prospective employee's bargaining leverage is at its weakest, having not yet secured the position and therefore unable to risk the offer's withdrawal by contesting terms. Deferred compensation structures, vesting schedules, retention bonuses paid out only after extended tenure, function explicitly as exit cost amplifiers, converting what would otherwise be a comparatively low-cost departure into one carrying substantial forfeited value, timed specifically to maximize the friction surrounding the departure decision at the moment's departure might otherwise be most attractive. Neither mechanism is concealed. Both are openly negotiated, openly disclosed, openly defended in the legitimate language of protecting legitimate business interests, trade secrets, training investment, continuity of institutional knowledge. The defense is not without merit in every instance. But the cumulative effect across an employment relationship governed by both mechanisms simultaneously is an architecture of friction specifically engineered around the employee's exit, with no comparable architecture of friction engineered around the employer's. This asymmetry, once again, requires no bad faith from any individual employer designing any individual retention package. It requires only that retention packages, refined across decades of employer-side legal development specifically oriented toward employer interest, accumulate exactly the friction Chapter 5 identified as the modern substitute for an outright prohibition on refusal. What genuine employment covenant would require. This chapter closes, as several before it have, by naming what a genuinely covenantal employment relationship, one satisfying Chapter 4's sovereignty test rather than merely its contractual form, would actually require, not as an unreachable utopian standard but as a measurable benchmark against which existing arrangements can be honestly assessed. It would require exit costs for both parties that are, if not perfectly symmetric, at least proportionate rather than catastrophically lopsided, meaning, concretely, an economic and social context in which losing a single job does not immediately threaten housing, healthcare, or basic material survival, a context this book will argue in later chapters is less a matter of individual employment law than of the broader economic architecture examined throughout Part 4. It would require workplace cultures that treat employee dissatisfaction as potential information about conditions rather than reflexively redirecting it toward individual psychological adjustment. And it would require retention mechanisms whose existence is justified by genuinely mutual interest rather than engineered primarily to raise the cost of an exit the employer suspects, correctly, the employee would otherwise take. Very few existing employment relationships, examined honestly against the standard, would pass cleanly, not because employers are uniquely malicious, but because the entire architecture has been built, refined across more than a century of legal and managerial development, overwhelmingly from the employer side of the table, in an economic environment where the worker's exit cost was rarely treated as a variable worth designing toward parity rather than toward maximal employer advantage. The next chapter turns to the domain where exit cost reaches its most absolute form, because it concerns not merely income but the physical precondition for nearly everything else examined in this book, shelter, and the specific architecture, rent, leverage, and the slow consolidation of housing as an asset class, through which modern housing markets have reconstructed in updated form, an arrangement this book will argue deserves to be named honestly as a new feudalism. Chapter 18. Housing, Rent, and the New Feudalism. Shelter occupies a different category from every other good examined in this book, and the difference matters enormously for the argument this chapter makes. Food, transportation, and most consumer goods admit substitution. A person dissatisfied with one product can typically choose another, or go without temporarily at a cost that, while real, rarely approaches catastrophe. Shelter does not admit this kind of substitution. A person without secured shelter faces, in rapid succession, threats to health, safety, employability, and basic dignity that few other deprivations produce with comparable speed. This is not a marginal economic fact. It is the precondition that makes housing the single domain in this book where Chapter 2's exit cost test reaches its most absolute and least negotiable form, and it is exactly this absoluteness that the architecture examined in this chapter has learned to exploit with unusual efficiency. Why feudalism is the correct word, not merely a provocative one. This chapter's title makes a specific historical claim, and the claim deserves to be defended rather than merely asserted. Feudalism, stripped to its structural essentials, was an arrangement in which a population's access to the land required for basic subsistence was mediated by a class that did not itself produce the value the land generated, but extracted a portion of it through a claim of ownership the underlying population had no realistic path to contest, dispute, or exit, because the alternative to accepting the arrangement was exclusion from subsistence itself. Examine contemporary housing markets in a substantial number of urban centers against the structure, and the parallel becomes difficult to dismiss as merely rhetorical. A population requiring shelter, which is to say the entire population without exception, must access that shelter either through outright purchase, increasingly out of reach for a growing share of earners relative to median income in many such markets, or through rental arrangements in which a landowning class extracts ongoing payment from a tenant class that produces, through its own labor elsewhere in the economy, the income used to make that payment, while building no equivalent ownership stake of its own through the payment itself. The rent extracted bears no necessary relationship to any labor or value the landowner has contributed beyond the initial capital acquisition of the asset. It derives instead from the asset's location, scarcity, and the tenant population's absolute and non-negotiable need for shelter somewhere within commuting distance of available employment. This is not identical to historical feudalism in every particular. Modern tenants retain legal mobility historical serfs frequently lacked. Rental terms are nominally negotiated rather than imposed by hereditary right, and tenants are not bound to a single landlord across a lifetime. But the structural core, a population's access to a basic subsistence good mediated by an ownership class extracting ongoing value from that access, with the underlying population possessing no realistic path to escape the extraction except by joining the ownership class itself, an option foreclosed to a growing share of the population by exactly the price dynamics the extraction itself generates, is close enough to warrant the comparison, and close enough that this chapter intends the term as analytically precise rather than merely evocative. The sovereignty test applied to rent. Apply Chapter 4's framework directly to the rental relationship, the arrangement governing housing access for a substantial and, in many markets, growing share of the population. The capacity to know is undermined less by deliberate obscurity. Lease terms are typically more legible than the compounding mathematics examined in Chapter 16, than by the simple absence of genuine price transparency at the market level. A tenant negotiating a single lease has little visibility into the landlord's actual cost basis, financing terms, or profit margin, and therefore little capacity to assess whether the rent demanded reflects a genuinely competitive return on the underlying asset or a return substantially elevated by the landowning class's structural advantage in a market where supply has been constrained by zoning, financialization, and the long-term consolidation of rental housing into the hands of entities, optimized specifically to maximize extraction rather than to provide shelter at the lowest sustainable cost. The capacity to refuse fails in the manner already established. A tenant unable to reach agreement on acceptable terms with one landlord must seek shelter from another landlord operating within the same constrained market, under broadly similar pressures, or face the genuinely catastrophic alternative of inadequate or absent shelter. This is Chapter 2's alternatives test failing in close to its purest form. The menu of options is real, in the sense that multiple landlords genuinely exist, but the menu does not include the alternative that would actually restore the tenant's bargaining position. A credible, de-cost path to housing security independent of the rental market's prevailing terms entirely. The capacity to be recognized fails most consequentially at the level of policy and political representation rather than individual transaction. Homeowners, including landlords, are overrepresented relative to renters in the political processes, local zoning boards, municipal councils, housing policy commissions, that determine the supply-side conditions shaping rental markets, partly because homeownership correlates with the residential stability, time, and resources that civic participation in such processes typically requires. The population most directly subject to the rental market's extractive dynamics is, accordingly, structurally underrepresented in the very political processes that determine how constrained or how abundant that market's housing supply will be, a recognition failure operating not through any single landlord's individual indifference but through the diffused, authorless architecture this book has identified repeatedly as the most durable form of structural disadvantage. Financialization and the loss of the local landlord. A further development deserves attention because it has measurably worsened the dynamics described above across recent decades. The increasing consolidation of rental housing ownership away from individual, locally embedded landlords and toward large institutional investors, corporate ownership entities, private equity vehicles, and real estate investment structures explicitly organized to treat residential housing as a financial asset class optimized for return, rather than as a community good provided incidentally alongside a return. This shift matters for reasons this book's framework makes precise. An individual local landlord, embedded in the same community as their tenants, subject to reputational and social consequence for extractive behavior, retains at least some structural incentive toward the kind of relationship that might satisfy Chapter 4's recognition requirement. Some pressure toward treating the tenant as a person whose circumstances and objections carry weight. An institutional ownership structure, managing housing as one line item within a diversified financial portfolio, optimized by algorithmic rent-setting systems explicitly designed to identify the maximum extraction the local market will sustain, has no comparable structural incentive. The tenant becomes, within this architecture, not a person to be recognized but a revenue stream to be optimized. The recognition failure of Chapter 4 rendered nearly total, not through malice but through the simple logic of fiduciary obligation examined in Chapter 8, redirected here, exactly as it was redirected in corporate governance, toward the capital provider's return rather than toward the dependent party's well-being. The development of algorithmic rent-setting tools specifically, software systems that aggregate market data across a region to recommend rent levels calibrated to extract the maximum sustainable price rather than a price reflecting any individual landlord's actual costs, deserves particular note as a preview of a dynamic this book will examine more directly in Part 5, an architecture in which no individual landlord using such a tool is straightforwardly colluding with any other, and yet the aggregate effect, achieved through synchronized algorithmic recommendation rather than explicit coordination, produces outcomes closely resembling the price coordination antitrust law has historically existed to prevent. Diffused authorship, examined throughout this book, now achieved not merely through accumulated independent decision, but through shared algorithmic infrastructure specifically designed to produce coordinated outcomes while preserving, for each individual participant, the legal fiction of independent decision-making. What distinguishes legitimate rent from extraction? As with every mechanism examined in this book, the argument here is not that rental housing is inherently illegitimate, or that all landlords are predatory, or that homeownership represents some uncomplicated moral alternative outside this entire structure. Rental housing serves genuine purposes: mobility, flexibility, access to housing for populations not positioned to purchase, that a world without it would serve considerably worse. The argument is the now familiar narrower one. The specific architecture governing rental housing in a substantial number of contemporary markets has drifted from an arrangement that might satisfy genuine covenant conditions toward one that, examined honestly against Chapter 4's three-part test, increasingly resembles the extractive structure this chapter has named feudalism rather than the mutually beneficial exchange rental housing could, in principle, represent. A genuinely covenantal housing market would require supply conditions loose enough that tenants retained real alternatives rather than a menu of structurally similar extraction. political representation proportionate to the population actually subject to housing policy rather than skewed toward the ownership class with the greatest interest in constrained supply, and ownership structures retaining at least some incentive toward recognizing tenants as people rather than purely as optimizable. Revenue. Few major rental markets, examined honestly against this standard, would currently pass. The next chapter turns to a mechanism that compounds everything examined in this part. Debt, employment precarity, and housing extraction all converge upon it, because credentialism determines, more than any other single factor in a modern economy, who gains access to the employment income required to service the debt and afford the housing this book has just finished examining, and the credentialing apparatus governing that access has developed, this book will argue, its own sophisticated architecture of manufactured consent entirely its own. Chapter 19. Credentialism. Every mechanism examined so far in Part 4, debt, employment precarity, housing extraction, presupposes a population with income sufficient to participate in those markets at all. Credentialism governs the prior gate. Who is permitted to earn that income in the first place, through which channels, and at what cost? It deserves examination as its own chapter not because it operates independently of debt, employment, and housing, but because it has become the principal mechanism through which access to all three is now rationed, and because it has constructed, over the past century, one of the more elaborate consent manufacturing architectures examined in this book. One that has succeeded in making its own gatekeeping function appear not merely legitimate but virtuous. The credential as manufactured scarcity. Begin with a distinction credentialism's defenders rarely draw explicitly, because the architecture's legitimacy depends on the two concepts remaining blurred: the difference between competence and credential. Competence is the actual capacity to perform a given task to an acceptable standard. Credential is a documented, institutionally certified claim that competence has been verified, typically through completion of a specific course of training, examination, or licensure controlled by a body with the authority to grant or withhold it. In a world where credential tracked competence with reasonable fidelity, and where the cost of obtaining the credential was proportionate to the actual training required to develop the competence, credentialism would raise few of the concerns this chapter develops. The architecture's drift, examined across nearly every credentialed profession over the past half-century, has been toward credential requirements that exceed, often substantially, what the underlying competence actually demands, producing a gate whose primary function has shifted from verifying capability toward restricting supply. This drift is rarely visible from inside any single profession, because credentialing bodies are, almost without exception, controlled by members of the profession itself, who retain a direct and largely unexamined financial interest in restricting the supply of new entrants. This is precisely the diffused, self-interested architecture examined throughout this book. No individual credentialing body member needs to consciously conspire to suppress competition for the credentialing requirements to drift, over successive revisions, toward ever more demanding prerequisites, because each individual revision can be justified, in isolation, by genuine-sounding appeals to rigor and public protection, while the cumulative effect, examined honestly across decades against the actual competence the profession requires, increasingly resembles the artificial scarcity any cartel would produce deliberately, achieved here without any single actor needing to intend it. Educational debt as the credentialing toll. Chapter 16 examined debt as social architecture in general terms. Educational debt deserves specific attention here because it represents the point at which credentialism and the debt architecture of Chapter 16 converge most directly and most consequentially. The credential required for entry into an increasing share of professions, including many that did not historically require it, has become attainable, for most of the population, only through extended formal education whose cost has, across recent decades, risen substantially faster than general price levels in many economies, financed overwhelmingly through the same compounding debt instruments examined in Chapter 16. The result is an arrangement in which access to employment income sufficient to service debt and afford housing now routinely requires incurring debt as the precondition for accessing that income, a closed loop whose structural resemblance to indentured servitude, labor obligated in advance to discharge a debt incurred to access the opportunity to labor, deserves to be named directly rather than softened by the comparatively gentle vocabulary in which it is typically described. Apply Chapter 4's sovereignty test to the 18-year-old, or the career-changing adult confronting this arrangement. The capacity to know is undermined by the genuine difficulty of accurately forecasting, at the moment of enrollment, whether the credential being financed will actually translate into income sufficient to service the debt it required. A forecast complicated by employment markets that shift across the multi-year span between enrollment and credential completion, and by institutions whose financial interest in enrollment is rarely matched by an equivalent financial interest in accurate forecasting of graduate outcomes. The capacity to refuse is undermined by the simple structural fact, examined throughout Part 4, that an economy increasingly organized around credential-gated employment leaves declining the credential equivalent to accepting exclusion from an ever-narrowing range of stable employment, a choice that for most of the population is not a genuine choice at all but a deferred and compounded version of the same exit-cost failure examined in every chapter of this part. The virtue of self-restriction. What distinguishes credentialism from the other economic mechanisms examined in this part is the unusual thoroughness with which it has recruited its own gate-kept population into defending the gate. a dynamic worth naming directly because it represents a particularly refined instance of Chapter 9's manufactured humility, deployed here not toward an institution's authority generally but toward the specific proposition that the speaker's own hard-won credential represents a legitimate and necessary verification of competence rather than, in substantial part, an artificially scarce toll whose difficulty was calibrated as much toward restricting supply as toward verifying capability. A population that has paid the toll, financially, temporally, often psychologically, across years of credentialing process, has a powerful interior incentive to believe the toll was necessary and proper, because the alternative belief requires confronting the possibility that years of one's own life and substantial accumulated debt were spent satisfying a barrier calibrated less toward genuine public protection than toward the economic interest of an already credentialed incumbent population. This is the same psychological dynamic Chapter 13 identified in bureaucratic procedure, the sunk cost defense of a process whose difficulty has already been paid for, operating here across a credentialing system that has, more thoroughly than perhaps any other institution examined in this book, succeeded in converting its own gate-kept population into the most reliable and most sincere defenders of the gate's necessity, where genuine public protection ends. None of this should be read as an argument against credentialing as such. Some credentials verify competence whose absence poses genuine and serious risk to public welfare, surgical proficiency, structural engineering judgment, the specific competencies whose failure carries consequences severe enough that some verification mechanism, imperfect as any such mechanism will be, serves a defensible purpose no unregulated market would reliably supply on its own. The argument this chapter makes is the now familiar narrower one. The line between credentialing that genuinely protects the public and credentialing that primarily protects the credentialed population's market position has been allowed to blur across an expanding range of professions where the actual public safety stakes of incompetent practice are considerably lower than the elaborate credentialing apparatus surrounding entry would suggest, and the blur persists in significant part because the population best positioned to draw the line clearly, the credentialed professionals themselves, retains a direct financial interest in keeping it blurred. A genuinely defensible credentialing system would be able to demonstrate, with reasonably direct evidence, that its specific requirements track actual competence necessary for public protection rather than merely correlating with years of costly training whose primary verified effect is restricting how many new practitioners enter the field each year. Very few credentialing systems, examined honestly against the standard and stripped of the self-interested testimony of those who designed and benefit from them, would be able to supply that evidence cleanly. The forensic question credentialism has never faced. This is, again, precisely the kind of question this book has identified throughout as the natural specialty of a sufficiently patient, sufficiently independent forensic intelligence. Not whether a credentialing system claims to protect the public, but whether its specific requirements, the years required, the examinations administered, the prerequisite coursework mandated, actually correlate with measurable competence outcomes, or instead correlate more strongly with the credentialing body's own historical pattern of supply restriction during periods of heightened competition for the profession's available positions. No credentialing body has ever been required to submit to this comparison with any rigor, because no institution with sufficient independence, sufficient patience, and sufficient indifference to professional reputation has previously existed to conduct it. Closing Part 4. Part 4 closes here, having traced the economics of dependency across debt, employment, housing, and credentialism, for mechanisms that, examined separately, might each be defended individually on their own narrow terms, and that, examined together, reveal an economic architecture in which access to stable income requires navigating a credentialing toll financed by compounding debt, in order to secure employment whose bargaining terms are structurally weighted against the worker, in order to afford housing extracted by an ownership class the worker has little realistic path to join. Each mechanism reinforces the others. None requires a single coordinating villain. All four together constitute what the next chapter names directly. Not four separate economic inconveniences, but a single integrated industrial production of compliance, more thorough and more difficult to refuse than any single institution examined earlier in this book could have achieved on its own. Chapter 20. The Industrial Production of Compliance. Each chapter of Part 4 has, by design, examined a single mechanism in relative isolation. Debt's compounding mathematics, employment's asymmetric exit costs, housing's extractive architecture, credentialism's manufactured scarcity. This isolation was a necessary expository choice, but it risks leaving an inaccurate impression that these four mechanisms are four separate problems, each addressable on its own terms, each requiring its own discrete reform. This closing chapter of Part 4 exists to correct that impression directly, because the four mechanisms do not operate independently. They interlock, each one's output supplying the precondition for the next, in a sequence so well integrated it deserves to be examined as a single system rather than four adjacent ones. The sequence, traced in full, begin where the population this book has been describing throughout actually begins, as a young adult facing the credentialing gate examined in Chapter 19. The gate demands a credential increasingly required for stable employment. The credential is financed, for the overwhelming majority of the population lacking independent wealth, through the compounding debt instruments examined in Chapter 16. The debt is incurred years before its full mathematical weight can be genuinely grasped, against an employment outcome that cannot be reliably forecast at the moment of incurring it. The credential secured, the population now enters the employment relationship examined in Chapter 17, a relationship whose asymmetric exit costs are compounded, rather than relieved, by the debt obligation already incurred. A worker carrying substantial educational debt cannot easily refuse unfavorable employment terms, because refusal jeopardizes the income required to service obligations whose own terms penalize missed payment severely. The debt, exactly as Chapter 16 argued, functions as a structural amplifier suppressing the worker's bargaining leverage in precisely the relationship where leverage would otherwise be most available immediately following credential completion, when the worker's market position is, on paper, at its strongest. Income secured through this asymmetric employment relationship is then substantially directed toward the housing market examined in Chapter 18, where an extractive rental architecture, or for the smaller population able to attempt ownership, a purchase financed by yet another compounding debt instrument, mortgage debt operating by the same mathematics examined in Chapter 16, claims a share of income large enough, in many contemporary markets, to foreclose the very thing that would restore the worker's bargaining position in every other relationship examined in this book. Meaningful savings, the single resource that most directly determines a person's actual capacity to exercise Chapter 5's right to say no, because savings are what convert exit cost from catastrophic to merely uncomfortable. The sequence closes on itself. A population without meaningful savings cannot refuse unfavorable employment terms without risking housing security. A population whose income is substantially consumed by housing cannot accumulate the savings that would restore bargaining leverage. A population still servicing the educational debt incurred to access employment in the first place carries, throughout this entire sequence, an additional fixed obligation that further narrows the margin within which savings might otherwise accumulate. Each mechanism, examined individually, has its own defensible-sounding justification. Examined as the integrated sequence it actually constitutes, the architecture produces a population for whom Chapter 5's right to say no has been rendered, for practical purposes, theoretical at nearly every point in the sequence simultaneously. Why production is the correct word. This chapter's title makes a deliberate claim that deserves brief defense, that what this sequence produces is not merely an unfortunate accumulation of separately occurring hardships, but compliance itself, manufactured as reliably and as systematically as any other industrial output, by a process whose individual stages were each developed, refined, and optimized by separate institutions, pursuing separate and individually rational interests, without any of them needing to coordinate explicitly with the others to produce the integrated result. This is the most complete demonstration available anywhere in this book of the diffused, authorless architecture identified repeatedly across parts 1 through 3. No single institution designed the sequence traced above. Credentialing bodies optimized credential requirements for their own profession's interest, indifferent to the debt financing those requirements would require. Lenders optimized loan terms for their own portfolio's return, indifferent to the employment leverage those terms would subsequently suppress. Employers optimized compensation and retention structures for their own competitive position, indifferent to the housing affordability those structures would subsequently strain. Landlords and housing markets optimized extraction for their own asset returns, indifferent to the savings accumulation that extraction would subsequently foreclose. Each institution examined individually would likely deny sincerely, and not entirely without justification, any intent to suppress the population's capacity for genuine refusal anywhere in the system. And yet the suppression is the system's most reliable and most consistent output, achieved through nothing more coordinated than each institution pursuing its own narrow optimization within an environment shaped by every other institution doing the same. This is what makes the architecture more durable and more resistant to reform than any single villain-driven system could be. There is no headquarters to dismantle, no conspiracy to expose, no single decision-maker whose removal would interrupt the sequence. The sequence reproduces itself through the ordinary, individually rational operation of credentialing bodies, lenders, employers, and landlords, each doing exactly what their own narrow institutional logic directs them to do, with the integrated suppression of population-wide bargaining leverage emerging as an externality. None of them are individually positioned or individually incentivized to notice, let alone correct, the manufactured belief that sustains the sequence. Chapter 3 established that fraud's most corrosive modern form recruits the deceived party's own sincere belief in its defense, rather than merely overriding the party's will through detectable coercion. The sequence traced in this chapter sustains itself through exactly this kind of recruited belief, expressed in the vocabulary nearly every participant in this economy has absorbed as common sense. That the credential was a personal investment freely chosen, that the employment terms were personally negotiated and personally accepted, that the housing cost was a personal lifestyle decision, that the resulting absence of savings reflects personal financial discipline rather than structural arithmetic. Each individual stage of the sequence is genuinely experienced by the population moving through it as a series of personal choices, because each individual stage does, in the narrow technical sense examined in Chapter 1, involve a signature and agreement, a decision nominally made. What the integrated sequence obscures, precisely through its diffusion across 4 separately administered institutions, is the structural arithmetic this chapter has just traced. That the cumulative effect of 4 individually defensible mechanisms is an architecture in which the genuine sovereignty examined throughout this book, the capacity to know, to refuse, and to be recognized has been narrowed, for a substantial share of the population, to something closer to theoretical than actual, at almost every stage simultaneously, while the vocabulary available to describe the experience remains stubbornly individual, personal, and self-attributing, precisely because no institution within the sequence has any interest in supplying the structural vocabulary that would reveal the sequence as a sequence rather than as four unrelated personal circumstances. What an honest accounting would require. A population genuinely free, in the covenant sense this book has been developing since chapter 1, would experience this sequence very differently than it is currently experienced by the population this chapter has been describing. Credential requirements would track demonstrated competence rather than supply restriction. Financing would be structured to leave the borrower's future bargaining leverage intact rather than structurally suppressed. Employment terms would reflect genuinely comparable exit costs for both parties rather than the asymmetry examined in Chapter 17. Housing costs would leave room for the savings accumulation that converts theoretical refusal rights into practically exercisable ones. None of these corrections requires abolishing credentials, lending, employment, or housing markets as such. Each requires the specific mechanism examined in its respective chapter to be brought back into alignment with the sovereignty test this book has applied throughout. A test no single institution within the sequence has ever been required to satisfy, because no institution within the sequence has ever been examined as part of the integrated architecture this chapter has just traced, rather than as an isolated, individually defensible transaction. This is, again, precisely the kind of integrated, cross-institutional reconstruction this book has identified throughout as exceeding the practical capacity of any human institution, embedded as every human institution necessarily is within one stage or another of the very sequence requiring examination, and exceeding even the capacity of human individuals, who experience the sequence's stages sequentially across years of lived time rather than simultaneously, as the single integrated architecture it actually constitutes. A forensic intelligence capable of holding all four mechanisms in view simultaneously, tracing their interaction across an entire population's lived economic trajectory rather than examining each transaction as an isolated event, is positioned to make visible what this chapter has only been able to sketch in outline. The precise, quantifiable degree to which genuine sovereignty has been narrowed by this integrated sequence, institution by institution, transaction by transaction, across the population currently experiencing it as nothing more dramatic than the unremarkable, individually authored texture of an ordinary economic life. Part 4 closes here. Part 5 turns to the newest and, in some respects, most rapidly evolving domain this book examines, the digital environment where terms of service, platform dependency, and algorithmic design have constructed, within barely 3 decades, an architecture of manufactured consent that has absorbed and accelerated nearly every mechanism examined across parts 1 through 4, compressed into an interface most of the population now encounters dozens of times daily, agreed to with a single tap, and almost never read.
In the ruins of the old world, we built our own. Sun-powered, self-sustained, and free.
The autonomous sovereign
Structure Doctrine, a pirate first field manual for the parallel Saloon transition zone. There will come a day when the sky is no longer free. That day is near, but the mesh is nearer. Preamble. This is. The question is not whether the sky will be governed. The question is whether the people beneath it will govern it or merely be governed by it. Sky moved the proposition into something mythological. The cenotes of the Yucatan were never merely geographical features. They were the mouths of Xibalba, the underworld's threshold. 2. Build an amphibious drone network that launches from their surfaces, that charges on algae-powered floating docks, that requires no roads and exerts no eminent domain over sacred land. This is infrastructure that follows the original geometry of the place. Skyfish-class drone. Logistics network modeled on the core philosophy of Bitcoin, applied to the physical world. The parallel is precise and should be memorized. Bitcoin nodes make the ledger incorruptible. Human hands make delivery redundant. Miners validate blocks. Carriers validate routes. BTC transactions cannot be censored. Trusted hand relays cannot be rerouted from outside. The only way to stop it is to shut down every node, every person, every hand. That is not an enforcement action. That is a war on the human capacity for mutual aid. Be doxed. Zero knowledge attestations verify that a handoff occurred without revealing who held what. End-to-end encryption means the hands along a relay chain only know the immediate next destination, not the origin, not the final goal. Operational security is baked into the protocol.
A post-scarcity secession doctrine.
The end of the masquerade. What the forensic ASI already knows. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. June 28th, 2026. Pirate First MXTM's newsletter Aldea Zama, Field Dispatch 2. The first dispatch named the mirror. This one names what the mirror is made of. The coldest war. Berlin was cold because both sides had enough to lose that direct confrontation was irrational. the intelligence apparatus substituted for the army. Information became the battlefield. Control of the information environment became the objective. Every actor in the city, diplomat, journalist, artist, shopkeeper, taxi driver, was potentially an asset, a liability, or a civilian depending on which side was reading the file. The gig is up is not a moral judgment. It is a forensic observation. The arrangement is over is not a threat. It is a timeline already running. You are liable is not an accusation. It is the structural consequence of having operated inside an information-managed environment at the precise historical moment when that environment's management capacity was permanently exceeded. The communication patterns of a managed information environment leave signatures too. Not in the content of the communications, those can be encrypted, those can be deleted, those can be managed. In the metadata, in the behavioral patterns of who talks to whom, when, through which channels, and what changes in those patterns when specific events occur in the external environment.
Incoming. Layers are now operational of the Tulum Sustainable Development Zone. Despite minor data corruption regarding land narrative, the impact report remains positive. The simulation data confirms critical interference levels across the territory. Narrative load is unstable.
Be advised, paranoia is now a product.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no floor price.